And welcome to Group A's Mapping and Anti-Oppressive Practice for Homelessness. We start with the three interventions being macro, meso, and micro. Micro, we've gone with critical time intervention, which is a 9-month intervention aimed at preventing recurrent homelessness for people with severe mental illness leaving shelters, hospitals, and other institutions, typically involving a single caseworker delivering services to each participant under supervision of a mental health professional. This intervention typically includes 3 phases, with phase 1 being transition to the community, covering a period before and after discharge. Phase 2 is the tryout, which monitors and adjusts support systems developed in the first phase. And phase 3 is a transfer of care, in which the caseworker will develop a plan for long-term goals with the client before transferring responsibility to caregivers and community providers. Our meso intervention is consumer involvement, specifically consumer-run programs and organizations which ensure involvement for current and former clients. This addresses a need to empower clients by giving them a voice and a sense of belonging. This intervention concurrently allows for collaboration and utilizes the personal experience and knowledge of clients to better address the needs of the community. Just a few barriers would include opposition from stakeholders and local community. This is especially true when looking for a location, as some neighborhoods and community members have in the past expressed concern with placing such services in their neighborhood. Also, difficulty obtaining funding and insufficient low-income housing in the local communities for clients, which may now serve as employees. There are some principles that have been laid out for consumer involvement, and just a few of those would be: the service must provide help with the needs as defined by the clients. Participation in the service must be completely voluntary. Another would be the responsibility of the service is to the client and not to relatives, other providers, or funding agencies. Information about the client must be available to the client. Our macro intervention is systems integration, which basically builds and improves on service coordination or services integration by requiring fundamental changes in the way that agencies interact, share information, resources, and clients. A notable example of this would be the Access program. And one study showed in the first year of operation, follow-up data from 73% of the 1,832 clients showed superior housing outcomes at 12 months. Some strategies would include strategic planning, cross-training, co-location of services, provider incentives, and centralized authority. Some recommendations for this practice were to focus on leadership, local coordinating body, strategic planning with an emphasis on outcomes, flexible funding, adequate resources, fiscal initiatives, focus on both services and systems integration concurrently, long-term commitment, and the need for technical assistance.
Looking back at the history of homelessness, using the journal article, Homelessness in the U.S., A Historical Analysis. Homelessness has roots way back in the 1600s, with boats of homeless children, vagrants, coming from England. During the colonial and early national periods, the homeless populations were primarily orphans, children living in alleys and abandoned buildings in New York City. The sense, though, was that this was no fault of their own. After the Civil War, homelessness became a national issue, and the general attitude shifted to seeing homeless people as inadequate and problematic. 1/4 of the homeless population were war vets, and half were mentally or physically disabled. Skid rows were born, and thanks to social workers advocating, municipal lodging within the skid rows appeared. Then the Depression hit, and homelessness reached record levels. The demographics changed, with more families and youth affected, and the blame was primarily on the economy versus the individual. With World War II, the homeless population decreased dramatically, and the skid rows nearly vanished. After World War II, the economy and workforce were booming. The homeless population reached a low record of about 100,000, and the problem was invisible and forgotten. Since the 1980s, homelessness has been much more severe and more visible, with skid rows overflowing into neighborhoods. Once again, the homeless population is primarily youth. The conditions thought to be putting youth at high risk for homelessness are living in a low-income family, having a history of high unemployment, spending time in foster care, living in a household with a history of homelessness, coming from a household with 8 or more individuals, or being gay or lesbian.
There has been a drastic rise in the number of homeless individuals in America. There are multiple hypotheses around what causes this increase. One hypothesis, which is receiving much attention, is the idea that mental health policies are severely underserving these marginalized people, resulting in an increase in the homeless population in America. Two main policies are being looked at. First, the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals, which includes the failure of aftercare and community support programs, which can leave people without the proper tools to thrive and can result in homelessness. Second, a further restriction on admission policies that function to keep all but the most severely mentally ill people out of psychiatric hospitals also leaves marginalized people without care or structural support, which can also result in homelessness. Being TEFL and Howe developed an operational definition of homelessness to guide respondent identification and selection. This definition specified 4 types or levels of homelessness. 1. Limited or no shelter for any length of time. 2. Shelters or missions run by religious organizations or public agencies. The facilities are operated specifically for homeless people on a drop-in basis and charge no fee or minimal fee. 3. Cheap hotels or motels when actual length of stay or the intent to stay is 45 days or less. And 4. Other unique situations that do not fall into the first 3 categories and the actual length of stay or the intent to stay is less than 45 days. Interviewers were trained to use random selection methods within various interview sites wherever possible in selecting the homeless persons to be interviewed. This, while it was impossible to use random sampling plan that was representative of the state and to allow examination of both urban and non-urban homelessness. The approach to the assessment of the mental health status of the group was within a traditional logical framework. One of the first discoveries made in designing the study was that there is no concordance among epidemiologists or mental health researchers about the most appropriate way to assess mental health need or psychiatric status. Traditional interpretations about psychiatric symptomology among homeless people were confounded by the fact that homeless lifestyle typically includes characteristics and behaviors that can result either from mental illness or the stresses of street life, or both. High reported rates of disturbances among the homeless are likely a consequence of a focus on behavioral characteristics. Such a focus could be misleading because some behaviors and characteristics that are related to psychiatric disorder also are closely interwoven with the stresses of street life. Both clinicians and epidemiologists must be critically aware of the presence of information that can function to distort a true clinical picture. Another issue that has important implications in both the assessment process and in the interpretation of findings is the perspective on the causal relationship between homelessness and mental illness. Some people believe that homeless people are psychiatrically impaired by virtue of their condition. For these people, homelessness becomes a principal diagnostic influence. Others, however, believe that mental illness interacts in different ways with homelessness. It may be the cause, but it also may be the result of a homeless lifestyle. Homeless people certainly process many of the characteristics that have been found to increase the risks of mental illness. Poor minorities, minimal social support, general disenfranchisement. Preconceived notions about the causal link between mental illness and homelessness introduces an insidious bias that can distort seriously prevalence estimates and clinical profiles. In summary, the overlap between homelessness and mental illness is where the tangled web of association between mental disorders and social conditions exists.
The article, This is My Community, Reproducing and Resisting Boundaries of Exclusion in Consecutive Public Spaces, talks about symbolic boundaries in public spaces that marginalize the homeless community. It talks about the insiders as people who contribute to the economy and the outsiders as people who are homeless. It also has the information from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which states that people are spending more than 30% of their monthly income in rent, and one of the main problems of homelessness or oppressions would be the lack of affordable housing. I also want to point out how they are marginalized and oppressed by how they are prohibit from being in certain spaces, like 53% are prohibiting from sitting or lying in particular public spaces, 76% are prohibited for panhandling, 65% are prohibited from toileting, and 43% are prohibiting from sleeping in vehicles. I also want to make very visible this chart or mapping that shows us the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, that discusses also the stigma and prejudice against the homeless community.
I'm going to do the portion that recognizes a organization within the United States. I chose the Portland Rescue Mission. It provides services to the homeless. It was established in 1949 by John Van Teese Sr. It provides food, shelter at the Burnside location. They also have an additional location called Shepherd's Door, which provides shelter and in-house counseling for women in recovering. And the object is to keep the families together, meaning children with their mothers. It has 2 homeless shelters, like I mentioned before. It also runs a nonprofit organization in reference to funding for car sales. This program offers more funding than any of the programs that the Portland Rescue Mission has. And their goal is to fight against homelessness and hunger. A few facts: addiction is prevalent with 68% of the homeless, 20 to 25% suffer from chronic mental illness. The Burnside shelter serves more than 333,000 free hot meals 365 days a year, and it's one of the only shelters that offers private restroom facilities in the downtown area, which is open 24/7. It also serves to approximately 1,000 homeless individuals receive mail there, because that's one of the issues with homelessness. They have no address. And so in order for their families to stay together and communicate, a lot of the homeless have their mail sent to this organization.
For our organization, we researched Kaya, Children International, and La Paz, Bolivia. Migration towards cities due to rural poverty has become a source of family breakdown. Children affected by violence or poverty at home run away to live on the street. This is one of the most complex situations for the country to resolve because it disrupts child development and threatens the stability of society. Street kids are extremely vulnerable. They are exposed to risks of exploitation in the workplace, the consumption of drugs and alcohol, crime, human trafficking, sexual, and other types of violence. Kaya Children International was established in 1997 when Dr. Chi Huang initiated a volunteer effort and coordinated with local church volunteers to reach out to the kids by building trust and relationships with them. Kaya researched why state organizations weren't stepping in, and it became clear that one subset of the kids living on the street could not thrive in state-run organizations. Kaya found that these children had long histories of trauma and abuse. Many struggled with drug addictions too. These kids became the focus of Kaya's efforts. Time is spent evaluating intervention strategies, expanding to offer psychosocial services, better medical care, improved educational support, and a strong grasp on the cultural, familial, and societal issues behind the ever-present problem of kids living on the streets. Kaya's continuum of care has been the center of growth for Kaya. Street outreach was the foundation. Meeting the kids where they are at and allowing them to lead the effort has been a big part of the success Kaya has achieved. The Kaya Center provides a place for children and families to come together to find healing and a sense of belonging, as well as services. The residential programs provide kids that don't have stable living environments or are living in the sewers with a place to call home and a loving family environment. Unlike other residential programs in the country, Kaya does not have an age-out time, and kids can never be blacklisted. The kids they serve always have a place with Kaya, regardless of how many times they have to try again. Warmi Kaya disrupts the trajectory of kids entering the streets by providing moms with support, helping them through parenting classes, developing basic skills, and finding employment. Kaya has grown and prospered throughout the years through anti-oppressive practices and has really focused on adhering to the needs of the homeless children in La Paz, rather than trying to incorporate their own visions and assumptions.